This is the beginning of our unit on metaphysics. There are lots of areas that you might study when you study metaphysics. The existence of God, the existence of free will. In general, it tends to be about sort of what sorts of things exist. You might talk about the status of numbers, right? Does a number two exist? If so, in what way, right? It might be in abstract objects. And then if abstract objects exist, what are they exactly? How do they relate with the physical world? And so on. So Uh, I've chosen to talk about personal identity over time. I find that people tend to relate to it sometimes a bit more than maybe, whatever, the metaphysics of mathematics or things like that. So hopefully you enjoy this. We're going to be covering, I'll set up some of the problem of personal identity over time, and then we'll get into John Locke, who was an important, his account of personal identity over time is called psychological continuity. It's very influential, maybe still the most popular account, and at least in sort of the folk notion of what personal identity is. He's also an important writer politically, and a lot of the folks who wrote the Declaration of Independence and Constitution and stuff like that were very familiar with Locke. So just to set up the problem, so suppose for a moment that I am on trial for murdering my neighbor, right? They play techno all night, right, till 4 a.m. And one day I finally just snap and I go downstairs in their apartment and I just stab them. Okay. Um, let's suppose the police have me just dead to rights, right? They have my prints on the weapon, they have my DNA, maybe video footage, right? It just doesn't look good for Nate. So I'm on trial, right? They put me on the stand. Let's say or let's say I'm representing myself, right? And here's my defense. I say, look at these two photos. Um, on the bottom, there's the murderer, right? Uh, and here's me on the top. Look, the guy in the picture down there, he's got long hair. I got short hair, right? Uh, that person down there, he was in grad school, right? But I have my degree. Uh, the person who killed that guy had never eaten eel. I've eaten eel, right? Look, if I'm supposed to be identical to the murderer, we would have to share all the same properties. But look at all these different properties I have than that guy. I can't be identical to the murderer, right? Logic dictates, right? Different properties, not identical. So I must be innocent. What do you think? Is that a good defense, right? Would you buy it? I think you wouldn't, right? Right? You would say, look, Nate, you could have easily cut your hair since the murder, right? You could have easily tried eel since the murder. You could have easily graduated since the murder, right? Um, people can change their properties over time and still be the same person. So that seems intuitively and obviously true, but it means we need a sort of different definition of identity, right? In the case of persons, than we use than sort of the mathematical or logical account of identity, right? So, like according to Leibniz's law, which is sort of a law of logic, uh, if two things are identical, they have identical properties, right? Uh, but what it doesn't sort of tell us is about what about identity over time, right? If you add a temporal right dimension, it complicates the issue, and we want to figure out what makes you the same person now that you were when you were a baby, right? You are much taller than you were when a baby. When you were a baby, you can speak English. You have many different properties, and God willing, you live till you're 90, 100 years old, right? And you die then. Um, you will have many different properties then than you do now, and yet we want to say you're the same person, right? So um, obviously you're not identical in Leibniz's sense, but we do want to say no, you're the identical person over time, right? Um, a similar thing, right? Similar issues come up for inanimate objects as well over time, right? So a rock can be eroded by the wind and the rain and the water, and a rock will get smaller over time, and yet we want to say it's the same rock. Um, but it's just sort of a particularly uh, relevant issue for persons because we want to be able to assign praise and blame, right? So if I commit a crime, right, later on, you want to be able to punish me and say you're punishing the same person, right? If I do something good, you want to praise me and say it's, yeah, I'm praising you for what you did before, right? Same person. Um, you know, determining property rights, right? You want to say that I have the right to live in the house that I bought, right? In the past, and so on. So there's lots of reasons that we'd like to have a good account of what makes you the same person over. So, I mean, one possibility we could call the spatiotemporal continuity account, right? And I think implicitly, as we'll see in the next slide, it's probably the account of personal identity we'd use in the murder case. Um, so it certainly seems to apply for inanimate objects, right? So what makes something the same object over time? Well, you just kind of trace its path through time, right? We expect, like if you see the picture above, we expect objects to sort of behave like in the top picture, right? We don't expect objects to sort of like go out of existence and then come back into existence later, right? We don't expect distinct objects to sort of fuse together and then pass through each other and things like that. Um, so there's something about the nature of physical objects that we want to say, yeah, you can distinguish them by tracing their path through space and time, right? For example, suppose, if this were a sort of in-person class and you're sitting at a desk and you wonder to yourself, wonder if it's the same desk I sat in last time. What would answer that question? Well, you'd want to know if it got moved, right? If any of the desks got switched out. And in principle, you could know that if there were security footage or something like that. You could just trace the desk's movements over time. And if it was in the same spot, if it stayed in the same spot, or even if it got moved but moved back, you would know, yes, same desk, right? You just, again, spatiotemporal continuity, you just follow the object through space-time. It seems like a perfectly good, definitely seems like one way we determine, right, identity over time. Certain puzzles still arise, right? So I don't know if you ever heard of the ship of Theseus, right? But this is an idea of like, oh, it's like a wooden ship, right? And over time, all the boards gradually get replaced. So in the end, there's not a single wooden board in it that was in the original ship, and still maybe we want to say it's the same ship. So there was, I mean, we're perfectly aware of the tracing it through time, right? But we still sort of have a puzzle about whether it's the same. So there's lots of puzzles that could arise, right? And in a different class, you might study that metaphysical problem. Um, but for us, we're going to ignore those sorts of problems and just see whether whether spatiotemporal continuity could work for persons. And we certainly use that, right? I think that's what would be at issue in the murder trial, right? Um, that's probably why you wouldn't buy my defense, right? About, well, now I have short hair, right? Because again, if you had footage, right, and you could run it backwards. So here's the person in the courtroom on trial. And the question is that person the murderer? Well, if you could trace video footage all the way from the courtroom, following my every movement through my haircut, right, or whatever, my graduation, all the way back to me in the room stabbing the guy, you would say, yeah, he's the murderer. Even though he had a haircut and he changed some properties, I can trace, right, his body through space-time, right, back to the murder. Um, and that I think would be sufficient in that context, right? Uh, but just because it's good enough for the context of determining guilt and certain things doesn't mean it works as a general account of personal identity over time. And it turns out there are actually important problems with spatiotemporal continuity as a criterion of personal identity over time. Um, and we're going to reveal those problems by asking whether spatiotemporal continuity is necessary and sufficient for personal identity over time. And let's explain what those terms mean. So necessary and sufficient conditions. So these come up often when we want to define some phenomenon or explain it. We would like to have necessary and sufficient conditions. This is sort of the best way of drawing a circle around all of the relevant things and only those relevant things, right? So if I want a definition of chairs, right, I'd like something that says, okay, um, everything and only the things that are chairs, right, will have these properties. Um, and those will be necessary and sufficient conditions. So, for example, a sufficient condition, right? Slamming my head into the wall as hard as I can, sufficient condition to give me a headache, but is not a necessary condition, right? So these necessary and sufficient conditions can come apart. There's lots of ways I could get a headache, right? I could drink a lot the night before. That would also be sufficient for giving me a headache. So sufficient conditions are, they say, yeah, if you got this property, you're guaranteed the thing, but it doesn't mean that it's necessary. And then on the other hand, necessary conditions are like something you have to have, but it may not be enough. You might need more, right? So in order to pass this course, right, you're going to need to take all the exams and quizzes. But again, that's not sufficient to pass. You also have to do well enough on them, right, to pass. So definitely, if you don't take them, you'll fail. But just taking them is not sufficient. It's only necessary, right? You also need more things. And then surprisingly few things in this world have necessary and sufficient conditions. Often places you have necessary sufficient conditions are like in mathematics and logic. So for example, it is both necessary and sufficient for a number to be even that it's divisible by 2, right? So if a number is divisible by 2, that's sufficient for being even. And if you want to be even, it's also necessary that you be divisible by 2, right? So there are necessary and sufficient conditions out there. Some things, however, like to be a triangle, right? You want to have 3 sides. The internal angles have to add up to 180 degrees, right? And these conditions are sort of both necessary and jointly sufficient. But then other things, a lot of things in the world, it seems, don't really have necessary and sufficient conditions, right? If you try to construct them and you think about it carefully, you run into a lot of problems. So, for example, chair, right? You might think, oh, chair, easy, right? Something you sit on that has 4 legs and a back, right? Well, if this picture is also a chair, right? It doesn't have 4 legs, right? So having 4 legs, I guess, isn't a necessary condition, right? But a bench has 4 legs, but a bench isn't a chair, right? So that's not, and you can sit on it. It doesn't have a back. A couch, right, could have 4 legs. You can sit on it and have a back. So if you don't think a couch is a chair, then maybe you need some more conditions, right? And you'll, I think, figure out pretty quickly that you're probably not going to be able to construct necessary and sufficient conditions for chairhood, right? But that doesn't stop us from looking for them, right? That's sort of the ideal, the gold standard. If you could come up with sufficient and necessary conditions for personal identity over time, then you will have captured it. So let's now test whether spatiotemporal continuity qualifies as a sort of gold standard type definition for personal identity, and that is it both necessary and sufficient? Well, we can ask ourselves, is spatiotemporal continuity necessary for personal identity? It sort of depends on what you're asking is spatiotemporally continuous, right? So if you want to say my whole body, then probably not, right? Because I could lose a leg, and you would probably say, well, yeah, you're still Nate. You're just Nate, right? You're missing one leg, but you're still the same person. So if spatiotemporal continuity is the criterion, it can't be the continuity of the whole body. So what is it? You might say, well, yeah, you can lose a leg, but still most of you is there, right? Does it just have to be like more than 50% of the body? Well, I think it's, suppose I lost everything but my head, right? And you were somehow like, I don't know if you ever watched Futurama or something, right? Where they have the head and the vat and but you can still talk to them and they answer questions, right? You would probably say, well, yeah, that's still Nate. He just doesn't have his body. So it can't be just like something like, right, more than 50% of the body is continuous. Okay, so if we want to still try to hang on to spatial temporal continuity, what is the thing that's supposed to be continuous? Maybe the brain, right? Maybe that's what's me, and as long as my brain stays there. Well, again, people lose parts of their brain, right? On a certain point, maybe you're not you anymore, right? If you lose certain cognitive function, but can't be you can lose little parts of your brain and still be fine. And as it turns out, um, uh, over a period of 7 years, every molecule in my body has switched out, even in my brain. Um, I may not even have a single atom, right, that is actually the same from born, for example. Um, so I don't know, it's up to you, that maybe gets fuzzy. Would you say it's the same brain, even if it's different molecules, right? Um, what makes it the same object, right? Is it the parts or is it something else? Um, Locke will get into that a little bit more. It's an open question and maybe an interesting paper topic. But anyways, sort of what ends up sort of being the death of spatial temporal continuity as a necessary condition is these sort of Freaky Friday scenarios that we can imagine, right? So these are definitely, by the time we got to the head and the bat, we're beyond sort of currently physically possible scenarios, right? But that doesn't matter, right? What we're doing is testing the concept, right? What are the boundaries of the concept of personal identity? And we're assuming that you, as an English speaker that understands these sort of things intuitively, um, that you can use these sort of thought experiments to test the boundaries of the concept, right? So there's plenty. I'm sure all of you have at one point seen a film like Freaky Friday, where right you've got two people and one of them's they both say at the same time, "Oh man, I wish I were you, if only just for a day or something." And all of them, and their like consciousness or whatever, their personality switches into the other body, right? Um, our intuitions, the reason those movies make sense, right, is because we tend to think, well, the person follows the mind, right, the consciousness. So, like if me and my 3-year-old daughter did a Freaky Friday switch, then you would say Nate is the one in the little 3-year-old body, right? My consciousness switched into that body. So again, this is obviously sort of a fantasy, not real, but again, it's just testing the boundaries of the concept. We're asking what is the concept of the person, and we want to say that it follows the consciousness, not the body, right? Because there now we have an abrupt um, break in spatiotemporal continuity at that moment of the Freaky Friday switch, right? The body has totally changed. Nothing the same about the body at that point, and yet we think we can still follow the person, right? So those considerations seem to suggest that spatiotemporal continuity is not necessary for personal identity over time. Might it be sufficient? Well, there are some counterexamples there too, right? For example, maybe put me in a giant, right, Nate-sized blender and hit puree, right, and I turn into a pink sludge there. Well, you got all the same Nate parts, right? They're just been sort of disorganized. Um, but I don't think you would say it's me, right? You wouldn't sort of bring a friend over and say, "Hey, I'd like you to meet, right, my instructor, Nate." Um, Something important about me is gone at that point, right? When I've died, even right, you see me in the funeral home, right? If I'm not a blender and just the same body, you might not quite say that Nate is here anymore, right? Um, so in that case, you've traced my body, right? Spatial temporal continuity is satisfied, but somehow Nate has gone away. The person has gone away, right? And again, also the Freaky Friday situation works here, right? If I'm able to, if we can conceive of it making sense of switching bodies, and then you want to say, well, the person follows the mind, not the body. Again, right? You can trace the body, but now the mind is left. The person has changed, right? So again, that example is a counterexample both to necessity and to sufficiency of spatiotemporal continuity for personal identity over time. All right, with that background, now we can bring Locke onto the scene. And Locke is going to suggest a different account of personal identity over time. It's going to be a psychological continuity account, right? And it's going to say, yeah, there's something important about how you react to those movies, right? Those make sense to you because, right, the something about the psychology is what we care about for someone's identity, right? It doesn't really matter what body. Um, but let's start back. I'll sort of walk you through the article that I gave you. And he starts way back with sort of the more basic concept of what is identity and how do we sort of trace identity for different types of beings, right? So first of all, he wants to talk about identity and non-identity, which he calls diversity. Same thing, right? Being diverse is the same as not being identical. So he's got a few. He wants to sort of establish, how he defines identity. So he says, look, anything that exists at a given place in a given time, right, spatiotemporally, is identical to itself and not to anything else, right? So if I'm sitting here on this couch, I can't be identical to something across the room, right? And I'm definitely identical to myself. Um, so a single thing can't exist in two places at the same time, and then two distinct things can't exist in the same place at the same time, right? Um, so this mug, right, can't exist in the same places. Right? It's not going to inhabit my body. I don't know. Maybe you could make nitpicky objections. You could say, well, I could sew the mug inside your body or something. I don't know. At any rate, intuitively, it sort of makes sense. Yeah, there's something about, right, physical objects. They typically can't penetrate each other, and they don't exist distributedly, right? They're sort of like uh, single clumps of matter, right? Um, but if you want to nitpick it and write a paper, sure. Okay, Locke then defines sort of three different kinds of substances you might have. So one of these is going to be, we've already heard talk of different kinds of substances with Descartes, right? We talked about physical substances and then mental substances, and Descartes thought that mental substances were immaterial, right? And physical substances were material. Locke actually carves out three. So one is God, one is a finite intelligence, which is in many ways similar to Descartes' soul, but also different in some important ways. And then bodies, which is the same as Descartes' so to begin with, God, we don't have to worry about so much when it comes to personal identity over time because uh, he has no beginning, never changes, right? He's always got the same properties at all times. He or she, right? Locke's going to use obviously the pronoun for God, but however you conceive God. Never going to change, uh, exists everywhere at the same time, right? So there's not like any worry of like if God cuts his or her hair, identifying him over time, right? It's just like it's sort of like ubiquitous and unchanging being, right? Um, so we can set God aside for now, for our particular, right? Finite spirits, right? These kind of souls, right? These intelligences. Um, Remember, Descartes said they're not in space at all. Uh, Locke thinks you can trace them through space. So wherever my body goes, my soul is there, right? Which sort of makes sense, I guess. I don't know if any of that stuff makes sense because again, these theories of the soul are a little bit undeveloped. Um, and then also, obviously, particles of matter, right? Physical things can be traced through space and time, and with spatial temporal continuity. And apparently, you can do the same with souls, right? You can't see them, right? But they do go through space and time, according to Locke. Um, and because they're different types of substances, they actually can coexist in the same place, right? So on the last slide, he said, hey, look, two distinct things can't be in the same place at the same time. But strictly speaking, that only applies to distinct things of the same type. So me and the mug, both being physical things, cannot exist in the same place at the same time. But me and my soul, right, because they're distinct types of substances, can exist in the same spot at the same time. And of course, God exists in that same spot too, because God exists everywhere, right? So different types can overlap. Two things of the same type can't overlap. Um, uh, is this true or not? I don't know, right? This might seem a little weird, old-fashioned and clunky to you. We're just working through his thing from the right 1700s to get to sort of the meat of the account, which is actually still pretty influential. But just so you can understand what you're reading there, because it's very influential. Okay, so he thinks this is crucial, right? This sort of like objects exclude other objects from particular spaces at particular times. He thinks if you don't grant that, then you can't even have a coherent concept of identity and diversity. He grounds the concept of identity in this sort of like spatiotemporal thing, sort of spatiotemporal exclusion of objects of each other. That's one way to cash it out, right? Um, it's an open question whether there's problems for that if you want to try to point out a problem for that, or maybe think of an objection but defend Locke against that objection. That's certainly a paper topic as well, right? Okay, so we have this conception of identity and diversity. We have these three different types of substances, and now he wants to talk about different types of identity over time. Uh, so first of all, you might talk about events, right? So a bang or this, here's an event, right? That event doesn't really persist over time. They're kind of instantaneous, right? So you don't have to worry about the identity of that clap over time. There's no question of is that the same clap as later. Events, right? Events are um, other types of things though, where there is a question of identity over time. Um, in some inanimate mass, right? Which Locke identifies as a collection of particles, for example, the mug, right? He says that'll be the same over time so long as it has the same atoms, right? Now the atoms might rearrange, but and interestingly, and this is a little counterintuitive, but he just sort of kind of bites the bullet and says, well, we need an answer to this. If this loses a single atom, it's a different object, right? That's a little counterintuitive to what we sometimes say, but it sort of makes sense, right? Because again, eventually every atom in this will be switched out with other atoms, right? Um, so you could say it's the same mug, and now you have a deep puzzle about what makes it the same mug, or you can just be like Locke and say like, nope, different mug. Lose an atom, different mug, right? And it kind of simplifies things a little bit, even though it's a little uh, in conflict with common sense about how we think about mugs. Sometimes common sense is, not the most sort of like coherent philosophy. But we're not so worried about that. I don't know. If you want to write a paper about just that particular thing, that's fine. If you find that weird. Um, so, uh, living creatures, um, different than inanimate objects, right? Trees, plants, horses, cows, dogs, and human beings, right? These are all living creatures. And obviously, those change over time. They gain and lose atoms. They get much bigger, right? And then eventually they die. So, Locke does for living things. He doesn't want to say if you lose a single atom, you're a different thing. He wants to say no, you can be the same over time. So an oak can grow from a sapling, right? Add lots of atoms, lose a bunch of atoms, lose a branch, still going to be the same oak tree, right? A horse can grow from a foal to a stallion, gain weight, lose weight, still the same horse. So how is that possible? How does he account for that? So, first of all, a living thing he defines as such a disposition of particles, so a collection of particles, as constitutes the parts of an oak, but it's not just the particles, right? There's something else for living things. He says, and an organization of those parts that enables the whole to receive and distribute nourishment. So it seems to be a collection of particles, but also, right, that's organized in such a way as to, right, take in nutrients and grow or something like that. Um, this sort of seems to be a functional definition, right? Recall Putnam thought he wanted to define the mind functionally, right, in terms of like what it does, what it accomplishes. And Locke seems to be doing something like this for living organisms, right? He's defining them not in terms of their physical set of particles, but in terms of like, right, a system, right, that does a certain job. So here's another quote. Something is one plant if it has an organization of parts in one cohering body, partaking of one common life. And it continues to be the same plant as long as it partakes of the same life. Even if that life is passed along to new particles of matter, vitally united to the living plant, in a similar continued organization suitable for that sort of plant. So he seems to be, um, right, reducing the identity of the thing over time to whatever participates in the same life, and then he seems to be defining life in terms of some functional organization, right? Similar with animals, he uses an example of a watch, which again is a functional definition. You can swap out parts of the watch and repair it, but it's the same watch. And then an identity of a man, right? Again, which for him just means human. He was using the male pronoun to refer to everybody, which we don't really do anymore. That's going to be the same. Importantly, this is different than person, right? For him, man is like just a living organism, not in principle any different than a horse or a tree, right? Um, but that's not going to be the same thing as a person. That's going to be distinct, right? So if you want to identify, right, the human being Nate, baby Nate with adult Nate, you just say, okay, is it sort of an organism participating in the same life, sort of organized so as to provide nutrition for the same body, or something like that? Or if you want to identify, if I end up in a mental institution and you want to identify me later with me now. You could use that same principle of identity over time for a living organism. Um, Now, he wants to say you don't want to use the soul as the criterion. So here is the difference between Locke, souls for Locke, I think, and souls for Descartes. Um, and maybe it's not a difference. I think, at any rate, so for Locke, right? Okay, a soul is a immaterial substance, right? It's this kind of substance. Um, and then properties will inhere in that substance, right? So a substance is just a thing that can have properties. Just like this mug can have the property of whiteness, a soul can have the property of feeling pain or remembering its 13th birthday or something like that. But if it's just a substance that can have properties, then the same soul could have like the properties of remembering being Nate when he's 13, and then later, after Nate's gone and dead, maybe a new person sort of reincarnates into the same soul or something like that, and the same soul now has different properties, and it's like of a woman named Jessica who's remembering her 11th birthday or something, right? So if the soul is just a substance that has properties, different properties can come and go, and you might actually end up with different persons with the same soul, right? So like maybe the soul that Moses had, right? He dies, and then Napoleon, right? And then Nate. Um, and if you thought, okay, what makes you the same over time is the soul, you'd have to say that Moses, Socrates, Napoleon, and Nate are all the same person, right? And that seems weird, right? So it can't just be the substance that sort of holds the properties together. It has to be something a little more abstract. We want to tie it to the actual sort of properties that are particular to Nate and they're particular to Moses. Okay, so we're drifting towards identity of persons, right? So we've handled, material objects, we've handled living things, and we've pointed out that souls are more like material objects, right? They're just sort of substances that can hold mental properties. So what makes you the same person over time? Um, so again, if you're asking for identity over time, that's a little ambiguous. What kind of identity over time, right? Are you asking, is this the same substance as before, right? If so, then spatiotemporal continuity is fine. And after you put me in the smoothie, I'm still Nate, right? At the level of substance. Um, you might ask if I'm the same man, right? The same human. Um, in that case, no. If you turn me into a smoothie, I'm not, right? The organism, the organization that allows me to sort of take in nutrition and grow and stuff is gone, right? Um, but I would be the same living organism if we did a Freaky Friday personality swap. All with right with that sort of continuity of like living thing, it does trace the body, right? But the body insofar as it keeps a certain type of organization, right? Um, Both of these questions are different, distinct from identity of a person over time, right? So put me in the blender, not the same person, right? Even do the Freaky Friday swap, not the same person. Um, so what is this personhood, right? Why is it special? What would be the right criterion for being the same person over time if spatiotemporal continuity and sort of the living organ functional definition aren't sufficient? He says, look, sometimes people define human as sort of rational animal, right? Um, he thinks that's the wrong approach, right? Just being rational um, doesn't make you human, right? So if you met an intelligent parrot, right, that you could have a conversation with, and you're like, my God, this parrot is brilliant. This parrot understands physics and can talk about all this stuff. You still wouldn't call it human. You say, wow, a really smart parrot, right? So what's the difference between a human and a person, right? It's not necessarily just intelligence, right? Okay, here is his definition of a person. So it involves intelligence, right? But not that alone. So he says a person is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing at different times and places. What enables it to think of itself is its consciousness. So person is separate from human, right? There might be persons out there that are not in human bodies, right? a really smart dolphin or a really smart parrot might be intelligent, might have reason and reflection, able to think of itself, have self-consciousness, right? It won't have a human body, but it will be a person, right? Um, so, but more importantly, right, in the normal case, us human beings that are also persons, right? Um, the human being part is just the functional organization that makes you a living being, same as horses and trees, right? Person part is this consciousness, right? Um, and that has reason, reflection, can think of itself as itself, can connect itself now to itself in the past, and so on. It says anytime you sense, think, remember, sort of part of that is you know that it is you that is doing it, right? Every conscious experience is packed into that conscious experience is an experience of the self, right? Of a person. Um, and so that's what unites all these various experiences as experiences of the same person. Every time you are conscious of yourself as yourself. And when you look back and remember, you remember yourself having those experiences. Um, so this is going to unite all these various experiences as being the same persons. And as long as you can look back in time and sort of remember, I guess, this is the part where it gets a little fuzzy. Um, you're the same person, right? Um, so this makes sense with our intuitions about the Freaky Friday scenarios, right? That's why when we imagine people swapping bodies, we think the person follows the mind and not the body. So I swap bodies with my right 3-year-old. Okay, now we say Nate has a little tiny body, right? Because we think, well, it's the consciousness. That's what makes you you. That's the person. Um, but this consciousness is a pretty out there, vague subject, right? So um, seems to be related to memory in some sense, right? This is sort of, yeah, as far as you can look back and remember, um, right? And you can sort of recall an experience that was you experiencing again with this self sort of tied into it. You're the same person, but does that mean that if I forget, then I'm no longer the same person? So I can't remember anything before I was like 4 years old. So I not the same person I was when I was a baby? Um, or does it have to be something like it's not that you have to remember it, but there has to be some sort of like it has to be somehow connected, right? So when you were a baby, you had certain conscious experiences that were followed by other ones, and you have this sort of unbroken chain until you're into your 20s and 30s and so on. Um, Problem with that is you go to sleep sometimes, so the chain is broken. Um, so it's a little fuzzy. Locke's not totally clear. There's lots of opportunity to interpret this, right? Could be an interesting paper. Um, but however you interpret it, he wants to say this is what makes it a psychological continuity account. It's your psychology, right? It's your consciousness. That's what makes you you over time. You could switch bodies all day long, switch souls all the time. You'll still be you if you can trace psychologically, right? So, different substances can be involved in the same person. My consciousness can switch souls, and so long as I have the same memories, right, I'm the same person. Um, Two different consciousnesses could inhabit the same soul over time, but they still be different people, right? If their sort of psychologies are distinct. Um, it also seems to imply that if I remember being Napoleon, that makes me Napoleon, right? Whether or not I actually was, right? It seems like a false memory somehow is still true as far as your personality, perhaps, or as far as your personal identity. Um, I mean, Locke seems to explicitly say, yeah, I guess if you remember being Napoleon, then technically you'd be Napoleon, but God would never really actually let that happen. Maybe that feels a little ad hoc, right? Then he comes up with his own Freaky Friday scenario, right? He talks about the cobbler and the prince, right? And he says, right, suppose one day that they swap bodies, the cobbler and the prince, and he thinks, again, our intuitions are that, okay, well then, after the swap, the guy that's fixing shoes is the prince, right? And the guy that's living in the palace is the cobbler because consciousness is the person. And so if the prince had committed some terrible crime, right? And so he switched bodies so as to try to get away with it. Well, if we found out, we would punish the body of the cobbler that had the prince's mind because we want to say we want to punish the consciousness that committed the act. So that is the account, such as it is, right? There's in a broad outline, it makes sense. It does sort of accord with our intuitions about this stuff. There's obviously some areas that need to be filled in a bit about exactly what this consciousness is. Um, but there are a few. He does have to sort of bite some bullets, right? And he just does that, right? Any philosophical theory worth its salt is going to have some sort of unintuitive consequences. And one thing you can do is just say, "Yep, this is the truth," right? Common sense is wrong in some ways. So one of the things, right? He had to bite the bullet and say, "Yeah, if I remember being Napoleon, you're Napoleon." Again, he says God wouldn't let it happen, but it's kind of obviously does, right? People with mental illness. Um, he also says, yeah, suppose, right, Socrates or any person, right, um, suppose that whenever they dreamed, it was sort of like a continuous thing, and they would sort of pick up with a life that made sense in the dream, right? So you sort of spend 16 hours in one life, 8 hours in another life. He would say, yeah, those would be two different people then, right? Because it's the psychology that matters, right? He seems to have to say, if I forget something that happened to me earlier in my life, then I'm just not the same person as the one that thing happened to, right? Again, I might be the same man, the same human, right? But I'm not the same person. And this is one way that he sort of like tries to blunt the edge of these bullets he's biting. He says, if this feels weird to you, right? If this seems counterintuitive, that's because you're thinking about human being instead of person, right? Don't confuse the two. So yeah, in a lot of these cases, you are the same human being. You're just not the same person, right? Um, some of the benefits of this is it sort of does make sense, like when we talk about the insanity defense, like why does that count? Why can you sort of be innocent of a crime or not be punished for a crime that obviously your body committed if you're declared insane? Again, you might say they were just a totally different person. There was a psychological break, right? So you weren't yourself. Of course, the problem here is it might also apply with like drunk driving, right? If you're blackout drunk, um, then you're not yourself either, right? So shouldn't you get off, right, for whatever? If you accidentally got in an accident and hurt somebody, but you were blackout drunk, then you shouldn't be punished either because you weren't the same person. Um, and Locke kind of bites the bullet sort of on this one too. He says, yeah, our laws often confuse persons with humans, right? But again, this person and human being distinction. But he says God's going to sort it out on Judgment Day and apparently let all the drunk drivers off. I don't know. But that is, yeah, that's Locke, his psychological continuity account of personal identity over time. And then next, we're going to talk about Derek Parfit, who develops this account into something slightly different, which he calls psychological connectedness.